Good evening and welcome to Alan's Italy. We are privileged tonight to have with us, once again, Professor Eve Dombra. Eve, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
And the last time Eve was here was 2 summers ago, 2012. I know, time flies.
Right, I can't believe it.
I know. And the show you did, actually you did 2 shows. One was on the Roman Forum and one was on the Roman portrait busts. The Roman Forum show is the #1 show of all the 95 shows that I have on YouTube. So congratulations.
Well.
Close to 1,200 views on in the past 2 years. And if you take the 2 shows together, it really comes out close to 1,500.
Wow.
So welcome back.
Thank you.
I'm
It's wonderful
delighted
to hear.
have you back. And the show we're going to do tonight is on Pompeii. And, Pompeii is, everybody knows about Pompeii, and it's a fascinating topic. And, a few things have been crossing my mind about it over the past couple of days, not least of which is that Pompeii really exists in our minds because of the disaster that occurred on August 24th, 79 AD. And if that disaster hadn't really occurred, Pompeii would have just been yet another Roman town that kind of disappeared into, into
Right.
history.
Well, you're right. Yeah, there's an irony there that because it had such a cataclysmic, thorough destruction, it could be born again, excavated, taken up out of the ground, bits and pieces, right? In the 18th century, farmers growing vines, the volcanic soil there has always been very rich, beautiful climate, south of Italy, south of Naples, drenched in the sun near the shore. So farmers digging down for their cantinas to store wine, planting crops would find pieces of the ancient city. And then before you have long professional scholars excavated. So the city came up, but because lights were turned out, it was destroyed so suddenly by that great eruption of Vesuvius in AD 79. It allowed us to see a whole city, pieced back together. Much of it today is reconstructed. Some of the houses and buildings were also bombed in 1943, World War II.
Really?
So much of it is reconstructed, but you get the sense, the flavor of a town in Roman times, right? In the first century BC to AD, of everyday life. So I think for tourists, that is the attraction, the great charm of it. And you're right.
And Frank pointed out before, very, very interesting, and I hadn't really thought of it that it's two things. It's number one, it's a tourist attraction
Right.
that everybody kind of enjoys on a, I must say, a superficial level.
Right.
And then there's, as a kind of like this excavate. It's an excavation site which professors and professionals
Oh, yeah.
really are using to learn about
Right.
what life was like.
Right. It's a great resource, and there are great chunks of the city within the walls of Pompeii that are not excavated. And in fact, in the last 10 years or so, there are teams, international teams, of university professors, students, researchers, not Italian, various Europeans, American, and British, who have returned to the site, right, with a great interest. When I was going through graduate school, Pompeii was not the main focus of interest. It was thought to be a little tawdry, overrun with tourists, kind of kitschy, right? Things were reconstructed. All the good paintings were taken out of the walls of houses, were in the Naples museums, etc. But in the last, let's say, 10 years or so, academic scholars have wanted to look at private life, the family, how Romans lived, the economics, how shops were run. So my interest was, as a student of ancient Roman art and archaeology, was that it takes you away from the grand spaces of, let's say, the Roman Forum in the city of Rome, or the Colosseum, or the great temples, and you look at streets that still have ruts in the pavement from wheel traffic, carts, fountains where families would take their water, where their horses and mules drink, and dining rooms, right? Bedrooms, right? The intimate quarters,
yeah.
slaves, women, and family, the domestic interior. And you're right, had not Vesuvius erupted in AD 79, well, the city might have eventually just been covered over with farms, taken apart, like the Roman Forum in the city of Rome. The stone, the good building material would have been hauled away to put up later medieval or Renaissance buildings, right?
Yes.
Yes, reuse,
exactly.
recycle.
Right, exactly.
But much of it because of the rain of pumice, what they say pyroclastic surge, molten lava and gases, the city was just covered and crushed with volcanic debris and heavy lava and pushed down, upper stories flattened out. But excavators can bring that up,
Right.
And
we were talking before about questions, that I should ask questions. A question just popped into my mind, and we haven't even seen our first image, but
yes,
very quickly. Ostia Antica. Right?
Ostia, yeah.
Ostia. Wasn't covered by volcanic ash.
Right.
Ostia Antica is about
Rome.
an hour, right, the ancient port of Rome, about an hour west of Rome. And yet it was pretty well preserved, considering...
Well, right. It's interesting that you match those. Travelers to Rome will know that you can get to Ostia by a little train ride, half hour or
Yes,
so from the city of Rome. It's on the coast, just like from Naples. You can take a little commuter train line south and arrive in Pompeii in 40, 50 minutes, an hour, depending on how lucky you are. But Ostia, you're right. Why that is a city intact. Again, it's a nitty-gritty working commercial town. And because it was not inhabited, people moved away. Malaria, swamps. The river Tiber empties out into the sea. The course of the Tiber changed over time. It was silted up, right? So it became a malarial swamp by late antiquity in the medieval period. So unhealthy. No one wanted to live in the area. And then slowly covered with mud, sand. So
Right.
since it was an unhealthy place to be,
Right.
although on the coast and the coastline it became silted up, etc. So that's it's an interesting point
Right.
there, and that's again a reason why stone wasn't reused, buildings taken apart,
Right.
right? Recycling is a fact of history. What
People
can be used.
people didn't want to go near the place because they thought it was...
You would get sick by 4th, 5th century A.D. Right? It was
So
uninhabitable.
the two sites that we focus on, one site we focus on because of the natural disaster, and the other
Yeah.
site we focus on because people were afraid of the sickness. So
Yeah.
that's how
Yeah.
that's how history is brought to us
Right.
by
you
these
know.
weird
Yeah,
coincidences.
it's not by 4th, 5th century AD, later in
Right.
Ostia, but yes. So
Okay, so
Pompeii.
show number 97, Pompeii, and let's first identify where Pompeii is for our audience. First of all, we use Florence a lot on this show. There it is, right in the center. Here's Rome down here, and Naples is right here, and then this is the Bay of Naples, right in this area, and this peninsula here is the Sorrentine Peninsula, and then the Amalfi Coast around here with Salerno. So Pompeii is like right kind of over here, not far from Naples, as you indicated, very easily accessible by the commuter rail line that runs from Naples to Sorrento, actually, I believe. And this is a map I've used many times. I think I used this when Frank and I were doing shows. This is Naples right here, and here is Pompeii. Here is Sorrento. So here's the commuter train line that goes around like this, winds up in Sorrento, and then the Amalfi Coast along here. And there's Pompeii right over there, and Vesuvius right over there. So, and there is a modern Pompeii. Here's the modern Pompeii
Right.
town, still in the shadows of Vesuvius. So these are, pretty courageous people. It's a
Right,
story.
right.
I don't know if I could do that, but okay. So let's begin with this and talk a little about.
Well, just
we're looking at.
we're looking into the crater of Mount Vesuvius. So it looks rather placid today, but as you said, August 24th, 25th, AD 79, it erupted. There was warning to the residents, great rumbling, earth moving over underfoot, and then before the pumice came down heavily, gases, smoke. So we do know, again, Pompeii, as well as other towns in the area, people were alerted. Many of them left, right? And what we have, we don't know population figures. Oh, maybe 12,000 in the town of Pompeii, maybe 25,000 in the surrounding countryside. So most people managed to escape,
Really?
get out of town. And we also have a scholar, Pliny, as you said, on the other side by Miseno on the little peninsula, who went out, a man of science. Pliny wrote the Natural History, a vast encyclopedia, collection of knowledge, and he went out on a little sailboat in the bay to make observations, right? To look at this great, what was about to be the eruption. But he didn't leave in time, right? That was his downfall. And we have Pliny the Younger, his nephew, writes about his father, his
Right,
uncle,
right.
man of science, wanting to witness the great eruption.
And that's the only eyewitness
well,
who
yes,
wrote about it.
right. Well, the nephew tells
The nephew,
tells
Pliny
the
the
tale.
Younger.
Yeah.
Right.
So if we may move on because
Oh, sure.
we have
Absolutely.
National Geographic, just to give us a sense of molten lava, of course, not AD 79. If we move on, these plaster casts were done first in the 19th century, and this gives us again victims. Right? We say the human element. There are about 400 of them, we think, found in Pompeii and environs, at least several hundred of them. Some are better and worse shape. What
Now,
are
these
they?
aren't the actual, yeah. Go
What
ahead.
are they? Well, remember, it was pumice, then sulfurous gases would have poisoned, suffocated people fleeing the city. If you waited that long, as I said, many people heard the rumbling and got out of town more quickly. So they weren't knocked down by fumes. Then there's, at the end, molten lava, and the sky darkened, right, besides boulders and debris. So those who were caught in it, right, excavators later, this is 19th century, looking, when they, what they decided is to make casts. And as they opened up the earth, dug through it, they would pour plaster into the space of the hardened molten lava, in which once held decomposing flesh and clothing. Right? So the lava, the debris hardens quickly, preserving a shape of a body, human remains. It takes time for the human remains and clothing to decay within that hardened cavity of the volcanic matter. So if the excavators are careful, they're not plowing, they're using bulldozers, they come across these, they would pour plaster in and get these casts, right? So this one, it looks like someone falling, but, right, someone perhaps falling, hitting the ground, being moved by molten lava and debris, right? There's another famous one of a figure that has heads and hands, feet tucked up, right? There are dogs that were found. Some were prisoners chained. Remember the Pompeians, like Romans, had slaves,
Yes.
owned humans. There were a group of people in a gladiator's barracks. We have a slide of an amphitheater, and we can talk about the Roman passion for blood sports, but
Right.
the famous gladiators, and in fact, one woman, the cast of one woman, and real objects were found. Some people were running with coins and silver and jewelry, and one of these casts looks to be like an upper class woman who had a cache of silver, precious, and scholars thought, what is she doing in the gladiator's barracks? Was she having an affair with a brawny hunk of a gladiator? Right? Think of even pop culture. In the ancient poets, gladiators were desirable, successful ones, like pop stars today. However, if you look again at the evidence, there are about 20 people huddled, casts of bodies found huddled in the gladiators' barracks, right? So people were leaving the city and they just took shelter. So the idea of this romantic or erotic
But not
encounter.
everybody left with the warning. Some stayed.
Well,
just today, as
Yeah.
nowadays, people were told about Hurricane Sandy, and they
Katrina,
stayed.
yeah,
Or
yeah.
Katrina, you just
or they couldn't leave, right?
They didn't want to leave.
Or some couldn't, right?
So that's what.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So we don't, and again, there may be more, not all of Pompeii is excavated. And in the early history of the site, in the history of tourism, these plaster casts would be, today they're in a storeroom at the site, right? They're very evocative. You could see them in some of the houses, people want to see them. They're well illustrated, but they've been moved around to make dramatic tableau. In the early history of Pompeii, when European kings and queens would visit, these would be placed out, and sometimes they would be put in family groupings, with no idea as to where they were scientifically found, or there are some notices of couples or families fleeing, children, one pregnant young woman, etc. But the earlier curators of the site would move them around to make more dramatic scenes, right? To inspire the imagination.
I'm a student of the Civil War, and when you look at Brady's pictures and O'Donnell's pictures and some of the Civil War photographers, they did the same thing.
Yeah.
They took bodies at Gettysburg and kind of moved it into position
I
to
didn't
make
know.
it. Yeah, there was one
To
where
dramatize it.
to
or
dramatize.
make a
Yeah,
better,
they put his rifle right
Yeah.
there, and they propped one up.
Yeah.
With the sight.
Yeah.
This was a sharpshooter, and there was this, sharpshooter gun like leaning against the rocks. So they were doing stuff like that as well.
Yeah. No, I bring these up because for the tourist, these are meaningful, because otherwise, right, if you go to museums, you look at our excavated sites, you see fragments of columns, right, parts of buildings, empty rooms, empty streets. So in ways this populates, right, our vision
Yes.
of Pompeii
Yes.
as strangely enough, ironic, a living town.
Like a wax museum.
Yes, yeah.
Let's
Great.
So,
The plan.
right. This is Pompeii now.
Yep, and that's the fully developed Pompeii, right? The white areas, right? Notice the white areas out by the amphitheater, unexcavated, right? So there still is a lot of work to do for future generations of scholars and archaeologists. What I would point out, note the grid system of streets, regular, rectangular, Roman. There's a wall around it, so it would have been protected. There's a river flowing by, it would have been close to the sea. And if we point out the forum there, that white spot.
This is the forum
Yeah,
right in the
yeah.
middle.
A
Right.
rectangular space, so that would be the head of civic, religious, and commercial life. Right?
Right.
The Roman Forum in the city of Rome, it should be where the major streets cross, but that would be maybe out where those Stabian baths are.
Right.
And you might have,
This would be the
Yeah.
center where everything kind of came
Yeah, but
together.
why-
This was over to the side, kind of.
yeah.
Yeah.
The idea is because there was an older nucleus there, an older development. And those streets were a
Oh,
little
so
crooked.
maybe this is the original, and
Yeah.
then everything kind of emanated
So
from
we can
there.
see development in the city plan because note by the Forum Baths there's streets are slightly crooked and twisted. We're not on a pure like to the
I
right
see.
there,
Yeah,
not
yeah.
to the pure right angle straight streets. So what we do know about this area south of Naples is that there was a Greek presence there early on, Greek colonies. The Etruscans from central Italy, the area of Tuscany, were there. And early Pompeii, earliest 6th century, we think BC, walls, not sure what kind of settlement. Earliest Pompeians came from inland Italy, mountain warriors, the Sabine people, who early on in the history of Roman conquest were fierce mountain warriors. And they spoke a language, at first not Latin, but Oscan. And they developed early Pompeii in the area around the Forum. And they were very much in tune to Greek civilization, right? The eastern part of the Mediterranean or Aegean, which was much advanced. And then the other great moment in Pompeii, and we would look out to the amphitheater and the street grid, regular and even, is that in 80 BC, Pompeii became a Roman colony. Right? At first, it was dominated by this Sabine people speaking Oscan, but drenched in Greek or Hellenic culture. There was the Pompeians wanted to become a part of the Roman Empire and enjoy its amenities. Right? Oddly enough, there was a war called the War of Allies in this, and the Roman general Sulla conquered Pompeii, but Pompeii is an odd kind of conquest. They got what they wanted. And the only punishment is that Roman veterans under General Sulla came and settled Pompeii. So they were given, for their service, you might say as a retirement payout, Roman settlers, soldiers, were given land in the very rich soil, the land in the area. We're not sure what kind of housing did.
That reminds me of the way Florence was settled. Florence was settled by soldiers of Julius Caesar, who were given a retirement community.
Yeah, and so we don't was land conscripted from the indigenous Pompeians, which were which had as I said, these Sabine people. Not sure, but we do know then. The city, we have an amphitheater, more baths, right? If we look over here, can you point to where it says Odeon?
Right here, this is right.
That's the theater district. There's both, notice the semicircular there is a Greek theater on a hillside, which was redeveloped under the Romans, but there's a Greek temple there, we call it the theater district. There's an area that might be a kind of gymnasium, a combination prep school, or even university for young men in the Greek system.
Oh, where was that?
It's
here?
A little to the side, a little,
Over here?
yeah. No, that's a little temple, triangular forum, a little bit north of the theater. But that would have been the center of Greek culture. So where it says Odeon, the dark spot, that was a smaller covered theater.
Right over here.
And the Roman colonists built that. So it's interesting that the Roman colonists took the center of Greek culture, which preceded them, and they left their mark there. And what was the Odeon? It's the name of movie theaters. It wasn't a place for musicals. It might have been a place, we don't know, where the Roman veterans met, right? But they wanted to be near the center of Greek culture. And the Romans also built more baths, because the public bathing houses, hygienic, the forum baths.
You have the forum bath here, and then you have
the Stabian baths. We can proceed. Predated the Romans, but they enlarged it. They made it beautiful.
I see.
Right? And then the amphitheater. Note the amphitheater. It's a great oval arena for sports, gladiatorial combats, and it was built against the walls of the town. There was open space there after 80 BC when the Romans colonized, and they built on the wall because it's the seating arrangement, right? The seats had to be built up over the oval arena. You would use good concrete, it would be expensive, but here they built up using the walls of the city for support, so it was resourceful. And plus, note how huge that amphitheater is.
Yes.
It could seat 20,000.
Wow.
We'll look at it inside in a few bit. We don't think there were 20,000 inhabitants of the town of Pompeii.
Huh.
So that meant had a regional draw
Oh,
for
right,
entertainment.
uh-huh.
People from neighboring towns would come.
I
So
see.
it's important that it's on the edge of town, free exit and entry, right? And part of the gladiatorial combats would be wild beast hunts, right? Animals. So you'd want to have them, whether we had, in the city of Rome, there would be animals imported from North Africa. Not sure if they had this in Pompeii, such exotic beasts. But even if you had a kind of zoo-like, creatures to be slaughtered, animals, you would want them on the edge of town. So that makes sense. So with Romans came a kind of systemization, right? We'll see more temples, but the kind of urban amenities, right, that Roman veterans and soldiers were used to. More theaters, baths, meeting places, and the amphitheaters. Perhaps we should...
Yeah, let's move on.
Yeah. We'll see these.
For sure.
Yeah. Again, we're looking at the Roman Forum, a great rectangular space. Note that the city streets enter into it, right? It feeds into the city
Along
network,
here.
yeah. Although we'll see later...
On the other side.
Yeah, right
coming
where
down
you
that
just
way.
were.
Yeah.
Sometimes they would put blockades off, right? They didn't want noisy traffic, right?
Yeah, I saw those
Monumentalized.
in later slides. I was
Yeah.
wondering what those were.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's a market right where you were in a second.
Right up here?
Yeah. So it was commercial, and then to the left of that is the great temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus. There's a Greek temple, the Temple of Apollo.
Right in
Note
there.
that's slightly on a diagonal. It's sort of predated. And then to the bottom left is the great Basilica, right here.
Oh, here, right.
Yeah.
Yes,
Not
yes,
a
yes.
religious building, but a combination law court, stock exchange, public meeting place.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can point out that building to the right, see, notice this building right lower.
Here.
Yeah. Interesting, because note it's the largest building. And if we pause there for a second, I'm very much interested in the building because it was developed by a woman patron.
Really?
Right. And we think of Roman culture in these towns as being highly patriarchal.
Yeah.
Right. Women not in politics, not in the army. Women, as supporters of their men on the home front, right? Mothers and daughters. So anyway, we have an inscription of that huge building, commanding great real estate, and then one of the major streets, Via del Abbondanza, is right there.
I know, remember that
It's the
street
building
when I was
of
there.
Eumachia. She has a marble inscription that she put it up with her own money, this
remember
woman, for her son, right? And not only is it huge, well, what went on there, interesting, but note the facade on the Forum has scallop-shaped niches, etc., right in here.
Right.
There were sculptures, we think, and inscriptions and image that matched buildings, that took for their inspiration buildings from Augustan Rome, that had references to the great mythological hero Aeneas, Romulus, founder of Rome. So playing off of what Augustus was doing in Rome at that time. So you might say up-to-date, chic, right? This wasn't a little podunk provincial town. Pompeii had ties to the city of Rome, and the beautiful landscape of southern Italy was a pleasure, full of pleasure villas and summer homes of wealthy city of Romans, right? So it was...
Was a good portion of the population.
summer homes,
yeah.
vacation homes, like you might think Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, the Hamptons, maybe Woodstock, right, of elites, I don't know. Anyway, in this building, most of it was uncovered. It seems to have been a kind of beautiful place, open
Right
air,
here.
with perhaps statuary, fountains, greenery in the center,
Wow.
for people to come out of the dust of the Forum to sit and enjoy.
Huh.
On the side, there's a colonnade covered, right?
Yeah.
But we don't know what went on there. Some thought there was maybe a slave market. There were some raised tribunals in the front. Some found pots and containers and thought that part of the textile trade, fullers, people who either...
What is this area right here?
Well, that's a great niche, and in the center of it was a statue of Livia, the wife of the Emperor Augustus.
Augustus, right.
So Eumachia is paying tribute to the first woman of Rome, and then First Lady right behind it there was a statue of Eumakia herself.
I see.
I would show it to you,
Okay,
but
we
it's
gotta-
bland.
I think we should move to some.
But interesting because it shows
Yeah.
an elite woman, right, putting her name on a grand building, making a gift to her city in the name of her son. Why? Because she was perhaps hoping that her son would have a political career. And elites of towns gave their money, right? They built the buildings, the infrastructure. They did this willingly because then they would reap, you might honor, fame, profits, right? Make careers for their son in the public realm.
I see.
This is an interesting view because you see Mount Vesuvius, how close it is to the excavated site. We see some walls, and I like it because it shows that in ancient Rome, we think of crowded cities, traffic, the hurly-burly of urban life. There's an orchard, right? I mean, in antiquity, there was open green space, enough gardens, even farmland on the edge of the fringe of the city. Right? So we don't see narrow zoning between public, private, industrial, and agrarian interests. Right? There was a changing landscape and quality to even an ancient town with green spaces.
Okay.
That is an example of the basilica in the Roman Forum, reconstructed. Of course, it has no roof. The columns aren't extended there. But I show that because this is one of the prime buildings that Roman colonists would need for their law courts. In the winter, when it's rainy, you would come inside for public speeches. Remember, in the Mediterranean climate, much of the public political life would be outdoors. Right? And it's interesting, a coffered roof, beautiful columns. There are the interior, there may have been a grand statue or a tribunal behind that, a speaker's platform, and various law courts. What's of interest here today is that there's graffiti all over the inside of this building from antiquity. Some of it Pompeians cursing their enemies in the law courts, hoping
Really?
from a good outcome from a
is that
judge,
right?
right? All kind of scurrilous and obscene.
Wow.
And though it's a place of business, right? Oddly enough, maybe the wheels of justice were slow.
When did
People
the graffiti take?
It was
Was
first
that at
century
night? Like they
BC.
come back at night?
I
and
don't
they-
know, but they had time to, carve a few things
Wow.
on the stone, on the wall, on the column, etc.
It's a beautiful building.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
Was that the way it kind of looked then?
Well,
Were they pretty
again, it's a
short?
reconstruction.
Yeah.
Coffered ceiling, large columns. The side walls could be painted to make it look like faux marble paneling. Right, so there's that kind of illusion of more expensive. But again, what is a basilica in later when Christianity took hold in the Roman Empire? Basilica was a place of Christian worship. But in ancient pagan Rome, it was a public building. Law courts, you might say a kind of stock exchange, a place for money changers, public business. So it could have multiple functions, right? And there could even be more than one trial or court case going on at once. You could have had movable walls or even curtains between the various, columns. But,
Just like in the Roman Forum, the basilica.
right, on either side,
Amelia
Basilica,
and-
Julia, and
yeah,
Amelia,
Julia.
right. So every forum needs a basilica. Yeah, and we can move on.
Okay.
This is the view of streets, the Grand Street, and
I love this.
yeah, and again those great uprights that block traffic.
Okay, so the ones in the front are the ones that were blocking traffic from entering
Yes.
the forum.
Yes,
So this leads into the forum,
yeah,
and those big blocks are preventing. Of course, nowadays they would come up and down.
right. You see that in I think
Yeah.
Rome, right? Besides near the Senate building, and note that narrow street, raised pavements, and note halfway down there are
Yep.
those stones. What do you think those were for?
Well, I happen to have done a little research,
Oh, okay.
and I know
You're a
that
good.
during weather when the streets flooded, the people would use these to walk
Yeah.
to the other side without getting their feet wet.
Right, and you would think that it looks dry. Many tourists know that you need a bottle of water and good walking shoes. The sun is intense,
Yes,
hot and
yes.
dry, but sudden rainstorms happen, And the city is up and down, right? The town of Pompeii. It's not all flat, so the water races down. So that
I
was
see.
very important to
I
get the
see.
water out of the town. The streets would be just up running like streams.
No sewers, obviously.
Well, there were there is some running water in some of the larger houses, but you're right. Most of the debris, chamber pots, right, the debris of animals, excrement of mules, cart animals, right in the street. You see that white box-like structure
Right here.
Yeah, a public water fountain.
Is that right?
Yeah. So water, again, lifeblood of any
Wow.
city. Emperor Augustus, end of first century BC, brought water to Pompeii, an aqueduct leading to where the sailors were on the coast at Misenum or Miseno, and a part of that aqueduct was directed towards Pompeii. So on the edge of the city, they'd be there. You can see them today, large holding tanks.
Isn't it strange that it would be right in the middle of the street?
Oh, well, because it was a public amenity. So you would come there, bring your animals, fill your big jugs, your amphorae. Larger houses could have their own fittings and have running water brought to the house. But this was for the delight of everyone, and often street corners. There are many of these public fountains throughout. And one would think it's a hub of social life, right? You go to get your water, you meet your neighbors.
Yeah.
In hot Pompeii, just now, as you leave the train station, you buy your bottled water, right? There are hubs of people selling refreshments. So, again, water was important to the life of the city. And there was also water that led to the bathhouses, which were important for hygiene and social life. Yeah, another fountain right there to the right.
Right.
Right. You can see the ruts in the street, the large paving blocks. In some of those near the fountains, there are kind of holes drilled where you could tie up horses, mules, right? So we think of traffic. Note that, of course, most of the upper stories of buildings don't survive, but particularly straight ahead, a narrow street. And if we imagine houses to second stories, right, it would be narrow and dark.
Yes,
That would keep
yes,
the bright
yes.
sun out. They would be used to it. But you could think how, you could hear people from streets, right? People lived closely, cheek by jowl. I think we can move on.
And that lasted into medieval times, the narrow streets.
Yeah, and here you are, upper story, again, reconstructed, right? There would have been balconies over the streets,
Huh.
but tight, narrow. The scholars have done studies of street traffic and wondering that some of these narrow streets, were they one way? What do you have a cart coming down one way and the other? You think about
Right.
Roman traffic today. How did they manage
There are a lot
this?
of narrow streets in Italy.
Yeah, how did they manage it?
Still.
And people bringing, foodstuffs in on
Go
carts.
up on the sidewalk. That's
Yeah,
what
yeah.
I've done a few times.
Yeah, but look, the sidewalk isn't much better.
No, I
And you think of filth, right?
yeah.
Out on the street to be taken away by a rainstorm and garbage. Right. So we can go on.
Okay.
Tight living. This is the theater, right, built on a natural slope.
Right.
We're looking at the back of the stage building. Right, of course, there is some reconstruction there. It predates the Roman, but it was restored many times. It was in that area of Greek culture called the theater district. And what's important to know, particularly when the Roman veterans come, if you look at the marble seats right at the bottom,
Yes,
right, by
yes,
the dancing
yes.
floor, the orchestra, they all have inscriptions on them. They're named seats for important people in the town. And and so when in full flung, when there's a performance, you look at the seating area, it kind of crystallizes or gives you the hierarchy of the town.
I see.
Today we might see that at Lincoln Center, but it would be who could
Higher up
afford
boxes.
or seats, who can afford the good seats or the family circle. But in Rome it was by law. Right, those on the town council, the big donors would seat in the front or the boxes on either side. There would be 2 tunnels on either side for areas for actors to enter the stage. That the red brick there glowing is the back of the stage building. There were boxes on top of that. But the higher up you go, the lower down you'd be on the social scale. And it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't be about buying a ticket. Many of the shows would be produced and put on by the people like Eumachia, the donors of the town, who would give their money freely for this. So often tickets would be free, but by law, you would take your place in the theater by status, right? And it was thought that in Rome and in other places, this was the one time where those lower down on the social scale could get back at people running the town, the people in the town council, because they would be seated on the front, and sometimes they could be booed or hissed. Right. And if you didn't like what was happening in town government, the people in the little cheap seats would boo and hiss, sometimes throw fruit down, not on the stage,
Really?
but on the big wigs seated out front.
And they wouldn't know who was throwing it, I suppose.
Yeah. So it wasn't just a performance of what was on the stage,
Right.
but it made the political leaders of the town very visible. And we don't know,
interesting.
did they do Greek tragedy, masterpiece theater for the Romans? Was it kind of vaudeville or farces, more lower class? They're kind of Attilan farces that are like medieval mystery plays, or even kind of entertainment that would be more like sitcoms, a lower level. We're not quite sure what went on there, but there were. This was a place where the community came together. I think it seated about 5,000, and today it's reused, for modern performances.
Oh, do they? Wow.
I think they do. They do some maybe. And Ostia, I know they do. I'm not quite sure, but I think they do some here occasionally.
Right. Well, there are performances. Somebody I know was speaking to me about the arena in Verona.
Oh,
Still
yes.
has operas and
Yes,
things
yes,
like
yes,
that.
yes. And there's
Concerts.
there's a kind of walking area for intervals. Remember, there's a temple nearby, and that was thought early in the history of Pompeii. There was an area, a kind of gymnasium, not just a gym, but would be a kind of a place, a university or prep school
Right.
for young men who would take leadership positions. So this was in the Greek theater
Okay,
quarter.
let's
Yeah.
move.
So the theater is right there.
Right.
Right,
So
and
this
all
is
those
where the
buildings.
theater was.
Yeah. And you want to point out that's Eumachia's building.
Right.
And
This-
that's the basilica.
Right.
And that's the forum.
Right.
So
Right in the
let's see
middle
where
there.
we go now. I think we
Okay.
can get out.
Okay.
All right, this is on the other edge of, we're looking
Right.
down into the oval arena, the amphitheater.
Right
and-
up against the walls.
Right.
Wow.
So ingenious, resourceful use of building material. Interesting. We have inscriptions, so we also know that there were donors here, important men of the town, and this is huge, 20,000. So again, we have football stadiums named after what? Commercial firms, businesses,
Yes,
right?
yes,
Donors.
yes,
So these
yes.
were just private men of the town who made good and gave it back to the town. They didn't call it an amphitheater. A name on inscriptions, and there are plenty of these inscriptions, say spectacula, spectacle. That's and what went on there were the spectacula, but that was the name of the building. So there's an oval arena for the gladiators to fight each other, to fight wild beasts. There would be long afternoon performances.
No, they were not chariot races. That
No,
was
no.
that was a circus, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Not
that's
chariot
right,
races, not the theater. So these were, and who were gladiators? As I mentioned, they were considered kind of sexy, attractive.
Tough
were their
customers.
thumbs down? Probably they weren't. They didn't fight to the death.
Oh,
Right?
good. I'm glad to hear that.
That didn't really
Really?
happen. No, they were. They were. Some of them were slaves. They were often on the bottom dregs of society. If they were slaves, then they were owned by the man who managed the kind of troupe of gladiators, right? Some of them were free men, and they could pocket some cash if they won. But since they worked for the owner, you might say, of the team, it wouldn't be to his advantage to let them fight to the death, right? He'd be losing
So what is
investment
that in
training.
Roman?
Well, I think that it's myth making.
Really?
It comes,
Huh? With
And,
the thumbs up and thumbs
yeah,
down.
so
you
yeah,
know.
yeah, and they were specialists. Some of them had different types of costumes. Some fought with nets, different Thracian, different types of swords.
Right.
And again, who would put on the games? The games would be free to most of the population, and this is 20,000. So people from outlying areas, the countryside, other towns would come. This was
Yeah,
big.
yeah.
And again, in the Roman amphitheater, there'd even be an awning because you'd be there for hours
Right,
under the hot sun. So there'd be canvas on top. I'm not
What
quite
is
sure.
this area here?
Well, that is a great palestra. So it's a great playing field. Not so much, I mean, other days it was thought it would be a gladiator's barracks or playing field. There's actually the area where they were hid is not quite there, but also an area for training, right? A great open space for that.
I see. Okay.
And if we look, there's also, note, this is an area that was, again, great grid plan. Note that there are often, we'll look at a few of these houses that take the, what time is it? If we look right up here, if you point there, we can look at houses and residential properties that
Right.
take up the entire space. Right?
Let's move on to some of those.
Yeah,
Okay.
again, we're losing.
That's the
That's a bath. That's part of the Stabian baths, just to show you that bathing houses were
beautiful.
palatial. The stucco decoration. You know, people might have lived in squalor in a little dark changing room that meant in the center of their area
Yeah,
for places to leave your clothes. But the baths were kind of beautifully lit, filled with marble, shining stones. But hot water, furnaces, probably full of bacteria, right? How often did they clean them out? Everybody would go in there,
Never.
right? So it's thought that you could really, if you had an open cut, you went in the baths, you might walk out with gangrene. But there were places also with exercise. You would see the neighbors. Men and women were separated.
It was a big It was a big conclave of social
Social activity,
Social
right,
activity.
right. Some of it not so good, some of it, people checking each other out, right? And not everyone was
A lot of
naked.
flirting?
Men,
Was
women,
it was
separate.
it co-ed? No,
Well,
they were separate.
the Stabian baths, big baths, had separate men and women's rooms bathing. If they didn't, then men and women would, in smaller, would come in separate hours. So it was seen to be immoral to have mixed bathing. But it was for hygiene. And in winter and cold months, they did have furnaces. They did have hot baths, sweat rooms, cold baths, plunging pools, and there were areas to exercise. If you're a wealthy man, you had slaves and staff who would guard your clothes in the locker room.
Really?
No locks, and you
No
might have
locks,
people
that's
read
true.
to you. Poorer people would just be thrilled to be there. It was hygienic, but idea is, did they actually have no chlorine? How did lots of people going in there? How did you clean that, right? This is hypocaust. This is how they heated. They'd have a furnace burning, and then you have a hollow floor. You see the floor is raised?
Yes,
Notice the
yes,
bricks?
yes.
So the hottest rooms, the hot rooms for the steam baths and hot water baths would be near the furnace. You'd have slaves, right, putting the fuel in the furnace, and then with bellows directing hot air to these hollow spaces. Right? Instead of vent, right? That's what
Yes.
they did.
Okay.
All right, this is a house, and Pompeii gives us a great collection of domestic architecture, particularly these sumptuous houses. The domus, our word domestic comes from domus, which is a townhouse, a dwelling in a city. And in Pompeii, we have our best evidence for this. So here we're looking into a house, right? There would be an atrium lit by a skylight. Here may be collecting water, but notice from the doorway, a darkened center, you have a view through, and the house has an interior courtyard. You might say a backyard, but a garden with columns. So just as we see columns in the public architecture, in the forum, temples, we see it in the private house. And to say the house is private is wrong, right? All of these houses could be opened, and these were luxurious dwellings of wealthy people that
I
we're
was just
looking
about
at.
to say, this is a wealthy person's
Yes,
house.
very wealthy. And the idea was that when you had visitors, maybe in the morning, you might have home office hours if you were on your town council. Think of The Godfather, people coming asking for favors, right? You had hangers-on, ex-slaves. You'd have the doors open, you might have benches, waiting room, and you'd want people from the street to look right in and see how grand your house was, right? So the house was not a shelter from a brutal world. It was also a place of business. It was a part of your public image. If you were a statesman, husband of son of Eumachia, or those who built the theater. Here you get a sense of beautiful paving on the floor. Note the wall painting. This is the house of Marcus Lucius Fronto. We have a name. How do we have names? Because there's an electioneering poster on his wall. He ran for town council. It stayed.
Really?
Just painted on the wall.
Really?
Occasionally we have names. Sometimes houses are just called House of the Beautiful Fountain.
Right, yeah,
Names
yeah.
made up, right? Or by later
This
visits.
is actually named after the
Yes,
person because
yes.
of the election.
Yeah, and it's elite, so we're looking in the major, around the atrium. But notice the wall painting. In fact, all of ancient Roman painting is often called Pompeian painting, so because this is where we have the best evidence for it. Not only there are other sites that have painted walls in a domestic setting. The walls are in true fresco technique. They're painted as part of the plaster of the wall. They harden to the wall. Note here in that back corner, black walls, fine architecture,
yes.
red. The pigments itself from minerals, the black and red from cinnabar, very expensive. So a visitor to this house would think just from the wall decoration, a very classy establishment. And if you look in that back view, there's a center mythological theme. There are thin cage-like structures. It's kind of flat and abstract architecture. And it's very highly detailed. So the wall system, years ago, people, early amateur excavators would just take out a mythological painting from the center of the wall, just break it out as part of the wall and bring it to museums, like the Naples Museum. Because they were interested, you have lots of mythological scenes, right? Mythological scenes, are the basis of later Western culture, old master painting. But the whole wall has a decorative system.
Okay, we don't have much time.
We can pass this for
Yeah.
a villa. The Getty Villa in Malibu in California
Right.
is modeled on the villa of the Papyri in nearby Herculaneum,
I see.
Herculano.
Okay.
So there we have the garden, the fountain, the channel, right?
And this is also
a view
another
through.
view,
Here's a
right.
view out there. You're looking to the glorious Pacific. But the idea of a view through the house, and if we go on, you'll see Pompeian houses here. Pompeian houses brought nature in. Right, not only was
Beautiful.
public business brought into the house. This is interesting. It's called the estate of Julia Felix.
Mm-hmm.
So we have another woman as patron. Think of Eumachia. This is a whole block. It's huge. It's over by the amphitheater. And what's interesting is we have her name on the inscription, Julia Felix, Julia Happy, or what. She's rents out. Notice there's a vaulted area. This house has a Venus bath, a well-to-do fitted bath. It has a kind of bar snack shop open to the street.
Really?
It has a restaurant dining area. She advertises to let well-to-do apartments for the elite. So it's an estate. It's a multi-use complex. Notice the greenery in the channel. Let's go through. So, and it's a woman as entrepreneur. In the interior, a little scruffy there. There you
Yeah.
see her channel, a canal, a great backyard. It's like a miniature villa,
Beautiful,
like you saw at
beautiful.
the Getty.
Huge.
And there's a dining
So
room.
this is a very wealthy woman.
Yeah, but
obviously.
it was open to the public. There were apartments. If you couldn't afford your huge villa or private house, you could live here and enjoy a bathhouse, right? Keep going. And so it shows a woman. This is from another house in Pompeii, a dining room. Those hard slopes would have mattresses on them. You reclined. You dined while you reclined. Think of sofa. In the center was water, and the water would splash out of the back there down a kind of arcade or a staircase.
Beautiful.
Right? So, and the idea, sometimes these rooms, as in the one of Julia Felix, would have fake ceilings with kind of stones, like you're in a rocky grotto, like a mythical place of the nymphs.
Right.
And you would have water and lamps. You'd be drinking back your wine in cups, reclining. Right? So a luxurious life. And many of these houses had several dining rooms. You would dine al fresco in the summer.
Look at this room.
Yes.
Columns inside.
Yes, columns inside. And what's painted on the wall are more columns.
Yes.
And a little round temple. So again, the idea of painting here is if there is no wall, like you're looking outside. But what are you looking to? To a beautiful city.
Right.
And then on the painted columns to the right, do you see there are raised areas like jewels and gems? So a fabled urban setting of richness and wealth, right? Of great luxury. So what you see in the forum the column is the building block of public architecture you have in the private house. I mean, would we have that today? I mean, you wouldn't have a picture of the State House in Albany or, you know, any monument in Washington, D.C. copied in your house.
No,
you know,
you wouldn't.
in your summer house. So, so much of the
so this
public
is-
realm. Oh, this is, yeah, a little bright in our image, the Villa of the Mysteries. In fact, the train stop is the Villa of the Mysteries, Pompeii Scave. You want to get from Naples, you get off here. A country villa now right outside of the town, both a working villa, and it has this painted room that surrounds you. Mythical creatures.
Have we run out of time?
Yeah.
We have.
Okay.
Okay. Well,
But
there
you kept
isn't.
me going pretty good. You kept me going. Are
Well,
we off?
We only had 2 more to go. No,
No,
we're
no.
still on. But you know, I usually end the show by saying our next show is.
Okay, we did quite a
Verena.
bit.
We did.
Quite a
I
bit.
think we did very, very nicely. Thank you
moved.
very, very much.
You're welcome.
And it was a pleasure.
It was
and
fun.
next week we talk about Verena on Lake Como, but we'll talk about that next week. And to my audience, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. It was wonderful having you back again, and please join us next time. Buona notte e buona fortuna.